While close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, just how close were the Edmonton Oilers to trading Leon Drasaitl back in the summer of 2019? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can start the season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's show, the mechanics of what was purportedly a Leon Drasaitl for Nikita Kucherov trade back in 2019, the newsworthiness, the credibility of said report, and how it all would have shooken out in a hypothetical world if the trade came together. So, at the outset, it's time for me, as host of Locked On Oilers, to once again put on my media literacy hat. Now, media literacy is a very, I want to say snobbish term, but the crux and the main idea of the concept, the philosophy of media literacy, is understanding why things are reported, how they're reported, when they're reported, and who they're reported by. Because all of that goes into understanding and developing the credibility of a news source, whether that be a publication, an individual reporter, or someone who's anonymous. And putting all of that together can be challenging. You have to put aside your own perspectives and take what's being given to you. So at the outset, anytime we are dealing with people in media, we have to address what their motivations are. We can understand some of what their motivations are based on the forum in which they divulge said information. If it's in a column for a newspaper, that has a different standard than, say, a YouTube video for a podcast or on a Substack, where you are an independent outlet. You are operating on your own, and you are not being held accountable to a higher standard of an editor, of a standards editor, which some publications still employ. But when you are talking about stuff like this, you are talking about trade rumors several years after the fact as to when said trade was purportedly being put together, and you are doing it on a new podcast venture that you are a new podcast endeavor you are going out on, it does bear worth a moment of pause to say, well, I know that Jeff Marek is trying to establish the brand of his new podcast. He's trying to get people to tune into his show with Greg Wisniewski once a week, where he and somebody he's been friends with for a long time, somebody who's a prominent figure in American hockey media, are going to talk about the topics of the day. And to get people to sift through the thousands of options you have out there as a hockey content consumer, you have to do things to get people to give you attention. And Jeff Marek has credibility, long-time Sportsnet reporter, has scooped broken stories, etc. But with all of that as a preface, I do want to say I would not get too hung up on this. Now, we're doing a whole episode about this because this is a fun idea, and this is part of why, if you're Jeff Marek, you report this, because A, it's way after the fact, so nobody's feelings are getting hurt. Nikita Kucherov or Leon Drasaitl, their respective feelings are not being hurt by this being out there. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if neither guy even heard about this because it came from where it did. Being so siloed in hockey media, I should say media in general, not just hockey media, being so siloed in media has given me a kind of perspective on what types of information gets out and what types of stuff doesn't. But as far as a report like this and a trade like this, we can put on our thinking caps. Would this have made sense? Is this plausible? And that's part of our media literacy, is, do we know, even if we're a little bit skeptical about this reporting, is it at least feasible? Could we convince ourselves it's possible? Yeah, absolutely. You think about where Tampa Bay was in the summer of 2019. You think about where the Oilers were in summer of 2019. That's reasonable. Jeff Marek has probably been sitting on this for a long time, 5, 6 years at this point, going on 5.5 years. But the time removed, the fact that no one's feelings are going to get hurt, the fact that Jeff has a track record of credibility, that can lead you to believe that this is reasonable. And no one's ever going to come out and confirm this story that's directly involved, whether it's one of the two GMs at the time. Julian Breezebaugh is still in Tampa Bay. You would assume it was Ken Holland who was doing the work for the Oilers. I suppose it could have been during the interim period where Keith Gretzky was the GM for like 2 months between Peter Chiarelli and Ken Holland. But you would assume it's Ken Holland and Julian Breezebaugh after the season was over, close to probably the summer, probably after the draft, but close to free agency, somewhere in that window. Is this believable? Yeah, I think this is perfectly reasonable. I think there's not a lot of question as to whether or not it's true. I think the question is more so why you waited 5 years until you started a new podcast to divulge it. But I digress. I don't like questioning people's motivations because it feels unnecessarily provocative. But as a media person, I do have these questions. I do care. Why were you, as somebody who was on the most prominent hockey podcast in media, sitting on something like this for 5 years? That, why would you wait that long when you knew this is something someone would be interested in? But of course, you're never going to get an answer on that because that is a siloed off person. That is someone who I think generally does a good job, but on occasion, back when he was doing 32 Thoughts with Elliot Friedman, there would be times he would say absolute nonsense on that podcast as far as doing favors for people. I can vividly recall sitting here in my room the summer of 2021, before the Rangers had traded for Ryan Reeves, and the Tom Wilson thing where he had ragdolled Artemi Panarin was still a major topic of conversation. Jeff Marek said something beyond the pale of plausibility. He had said, well, maybe the Ducks could get a first-round pick for Nick Delorier from the Rangers because they need an answer to their Tom Wilson problem. And something like that is where I get an air of skepticism about this report. And all of this is to say, this episode is going to be fun. I am not in this for the credibility of the report. I think you are all familiar with this premise if you've been in a fantasy football league before where you've tried to facilitate a trade and it didn't come together. But then after the fact, you get to tell your friends, well, I was that close to trading for Christian McCaffrey going into last season in a dynasty league. I was this close to getting a Amon-Ra St. Brown for like Drake London and Brian Robinson. I was close, but you didn't do it. So with that in mind, we're going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to break down how this trade would have gone down in 2019. We're going to look at where the Oilers and the Lightning both were, respectively, where Kucherov and Draisaitl were in their respective careers, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. Today's episode is sponsored by PrizePicks. If you love sports, you're going to love PrizePicks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your favorite sports, PrizePicks makes it easy to get in on the action. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on PrizePicks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30 million in rewards during Picksmas and offering 2 free picks in December. When your picks hit, PrizePicks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. This week on PrizePicks, I'm eyeing the hockey board. Tonight, you could do something like Leon Drasaitl more than 1.5 points or Evan Bouchard more than 3.5 shots on goal. It is so simple to make my picks and have fun with friends while potentially cashing out fast. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly. PrizePicks. Run your game. Today's show is also brought to you by SelectQuote. The World Series, Super Bowl, Olympics, the world's top athletes get to play in these top-level sporting events thanks to one thing: teamwork. Teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. they can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. Select Quotes is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. Other life insurance brokers offer impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more and cover you less, while Select Quotes licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs in as little as 15 minutes. If you are in good health, they work with carriers that could get you same-day coverage for up to $5 million, no medical exam required. These policies are more affordable than you think. You could get coverage for up to $1 million for as little as $20 a month. Select Quote. They shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl today to get started at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the Edmonton Oilers showdown with the Boston Bruins. We will have an episode for you soon as the game is over tonight, Thursday night into Friday morning. Whatever time the game ends, I usually am pretty good about getting right to it as soon as the game ends. But as for the hypotheticals of the world, to quote, I love doing hypotheticals like this because they're good thought exercises, and this is how you can kind of explore your mind, expand your mind, expose yourself to new perspectives. Because if you think about it in the abstract, 2018, 2019, the Lightning have an all-time great regular season. They set the points record to that point. The Bruins eventually break it a couple years later and also lose in the first round, which is funny. But the Lightning set the points record in the regular season. Nikita Kucherov wins the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player. That team has made a lot of moves over the years to get themselves where they think they're close. All-time great regular season. They go into that first round series against the lame duck Blue Jackets. And if you'll recall, that Blue Jackets team, Sergei Bobrovsky, pending UFA, he went to Florida. Artemi Panarin, pending UFA, he went to the Rangers. Matt Duchene, pending UFA, he went to the Predators. That team's three best players, I should say, not forwards. Bobrovsky's obviously not a forward. That team's three best players all left the team after that season in free agency for greener pastures, for bigger paydays. And that team, which was a lame duck team, somehow swept the best regular season team of all time in this format. So naturally, after a couple of close calls, including some conference finals appearance, losing in the Cup final to Chicago 4 years prior, it naturally came up as a point of conversation. Do the Lightning need to blow it up, to reconfigure, to shake things up? Because when you do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. You are not going to be able to enact meaningful change without enacting meaningful change. Comfort is the enemy of death, and you don't want to be comfortable. You don't want to be comfortable, because if you are a team of comfortable players, you are not pushing, you are not grinding, you are not as desperate as you need to be. And that Lightning team, for lack of a better word, did have some questions about its tenacity, about its playoff acumen, because of the style of play they so heavily featured. And ultimately, they were able to solve their issues. They traded for Blake Coleman. They traded for Barclay Goodrow. They developed Yanni Gourde. They developed Anthony Cirelli. They developed Braden Point. They had developed Alex Killorn. You had a really strong supporting cast of guys like Palat, like Killorn, in addition to the Kucherov, the Stamkos, and Point really comes into his own the first year they win the Stanley Cup 2019-2020. You think about the defense, Hedman, McDonough, Sergachev, Chernak, Vasilevsky, of course, who's one of, if not the best goalie of his era. And it came together for them. There's a world where they pull this trade off, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But that changes your calculus a little bit. You probably end up having Draisaitl down the middle, maybe you don't have as much breeding point on the team the year after, and maybe that stunts his growth because he doesn't have the opportunity to play with some of the more high-end players in the lineup because you want to feature Draisaitl so prominently because you traded Kucherov, your best player, to get him. From the Oilers' perspective, they fire coaches in season. They fire general manager at midway through. I should say at the end of the regular season, they fire Peter Chiarelli, and they end up with Keith Gretzky as the interim GM, and then eventually hire Ken Holland. But you have all of that working together. You have McDavid and Draisaitl. You've been to the playoffs once in the entire time you've had both of them. You went to the second round. You lost to the Ducks, who ultimately lost to, I believe, the Sharks in 2016. That might have been Nashville. I think that was Nashville. I think the Sharks were the second time when the Penguins went to the Cup final. But that's neither here nor there. As far as the mechanics and like the fit, if you drop Kucherov on McDavid's wing, that's a very scary proposition for the rest of the NHL. Now, the Oilers would have still had lineup issues, and they still very much would have need to spend the subsequent seasons on building out the team's depths. And it took the Oilers quite a while to find quality, meaningful depth to support their best guys. Evander Kane fits the bill, even if he hasn't necessarily been the most consistent in that tier. Nugent-Hopkins doesn't really explode until the few years later. Hyman, of course, isn't until a few years later. You don't really have the quality supporting cast you need to make Draisaitl and McDavid, or in this case, in our hypothetical, McDavid and Kucherov, as dangerous as they need to be, because those guys can only play so many minutes. But if you go back and you look at it, on paper, the fit is reasonable. On a value premise, Kucherov is about to enter the first year of an 8-year deal worth $9.5 million per year. Draisaitl is entering year 3 of an $8.5 million a year deal. Draisaitl is 23 turning 24. Kucherov is 25 turning 26. If you are the Lightning, you would have done this trade to get a little bit younger. You would have saved $1 million. That really wouldn't have mattered, neither here nor there. But I do think from a Lightning perspective, if you started to orient the team around Point, Draisaitl, Cirelli earlier, and you maybe move on from Killorn, Palat, Gaudreau, Coleman eventually, do you even trade for Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman the following year at the deadline ahead of the pandemic and then the bubble? Do you bother? Do you know how good your team is? Do you feel that with Draisaitl as your number 2 or your number 1 center, with Point as your 2, Cirelli in the mix as well, what do you do? And that's where this becomes an interesting thought exercise. For Edmonton, this is about getting the best player you possibly can. And look, I think the difference between Kucherov and Draisaitl isn't very big. I think I would probably rather have Draisaitl in the present just because he's a few years younger. But Kucherov is one of the defining players of this era. On a wing, a little bit less impact, doesn't necessarily do as much as Draisaitl in terms of the two-way game, especially this year. But Draisaitl wasn't exactly a defensive stalwart 5 years ago. But if you were to have executed this trade and you played Kucherov with McDavid, I think there's a good chance you see one of those guys, if not both of those guys, flirt with 150, 160 points. And it'd be very interesting from a power play perspective because Kucherov is usually more of a facilitator than a shooter on that man advantage. I'd be very curious to see what that does for his game, what it does for McDavid's game, because, McDavid loves to facilitate on the man advantage. He sets Leon up for the one-timer, Hyman up for the backdoor, or Bouchard for the big point shot, whereas Kucherov, he's usually stationed a bit closer to the half wall, to the boards, and he's trying to fire that cross-seam pass across, and historically, it had been for a Steven Stamkos one-timer. Now it's a little bit different, but it's an interesting thought, and it's something that is fun to talk about, and why it's low stakes, where even if this is nonsense, it's not hurting anyone, so it's reasonable. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll talk about the hypotheticals of how this would have all shaken out and what those teams would look like now, coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. In the NFL, Thursday Night Football tonight's pretty good. AFC West battle matters for wild card seeding. The Broncos, plucky with Bo Nix, 2.5-point favorites going to LA to take on the Chargers. Steelers, Ravens, Saturday afternoon in the midst of the college football playoff games. You've got Russell Wilson and the Steelers heading down to Baltimore to take on Lamar and the Ravens, where the Ravens are 6.5-point favorites. And then the other interesting game this upcoming week, the potential for snow up in Green Bay on Monday Night Football, where the 14.5-point underdog Saints are heading to Green Bay to take on the surging Green Bay Packers and Jordan Love. You can get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. It's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking all about the hypothetical, purported, reported, but not really, maybe trade of Leon Drasaitl for Nikita Kucherov back in the summer of 2019. And this is a particularly interesting thought experiment in that these are two players, different positions, 2-year age gap, slightly different money, but have had very different team results. You know, you think about the Lightning during Nikita Kucherov's time with Tampa Bay, and they have been perennial Stanley Cup contenders. When you go and look at the Lightning since he got there, his first full season is 2014, 2015. And from there on, the Lightning are consistently in the mix. In 2014, 2015, they go to the Cup final, they lose to Chicago. The year after, they go to the conference final, they lose to Tampa Bay. They miss the playoffs. They go to the conference finals, they lose to Washington, who wins the Cup. They lose to Columbus, and they have the opportunity for the big reset, and that sets the table for this hypothetical trade of Draisaitl for Kucherov. And they stay the course. They keep Kucherov, and they say, we think we're close. We just need to tinker around the edges. We just need to find the missing pieces. We need to add to our secret sauce. And they end up finding a mix that works for them. They have that Stamkos group. They have the Palat group. You have a third line of Gord, Gaudreau, and Blake Coleman. You have Pat Maroon on the fourth line that everybody still talks up as being an essential component to their success. That team wins the Stanley Cup. The following year, Kucherov misses the entire regular season. He plays in the playoffs only, has another more than point per game performance in the postseason. They win 2 straight cups. They solidify themselves as arguably the best team of the 21st century, going back to back. I know Pittsburgh also went back to back earlier in the decade, in the mid 2010s, but I don't think you're going to find somebody to argue that Pittsburgh team was better than either Tampa team. The Tampa teams were just deeper. Yes, Sidney Crosby is in 2016 and 2017 was better than anybody on Tampa Bay. But once you get past that, you know, Kucherov is arguably a smidge below in terms of talent. Obviously, he doesn't have the accomplishments or the longevity of Sidney Crosby, but Kucherov, an extremely talented hockey player and somebody who's going to be remembered as one of the best playoff performers of his era. Stamkos, you know, he doesn't play on that first cup winner, but he does on the second one. And I think you would take him over Malkin contemporarily if you were to talk about it big picture. Hedman, better than Letang for sure. Vasilevsky, better than Fleury or Matt Murray, whichever one you want to take. You get down into the depth, and yeah, Hagelin, Bonino, and Kessel was a very good line, but wasn't better than that Cirelli line the second time around. You know, that Tampa Bay team is one of the great teams of the 21st century, and the fact they were able to run it back relatively easily 2 years in a row. And look, I understand a little bit different with bubbles, weird schedule the year after, the heavy the division only schedule, the playoff format was wonky the first year. I get all of that, but that Tampa Bay team is one for the ages. And when you compare that to Draisaitl's tenure in Edmonton, where they make the playoffs a few years into his tenure in Edmonton, I think it's his third NHL season. they make the playoffs for the first time, if I remember correctly. 1, 2. Yeah, I think it's his third. I want to get this right because this does matter, but I'm pretty sure it's his third season they get to the playoffs for the first time. His first season, Draisaitl's, is 14-15. That's not a full season, but 14-15. Yeah, so his second full season, 16-17, is the first time the Oilers make the playoffs. He makes the playoffs for the first time as a 21-year-old. He does not get back to the playoffs, the real playoffs, for 4 more seasons. I know you could say, well, they made the bubble playoffs. I am not counting the bubble playoffs as making the playoffs. An expanded field reduces the barrier, reduces the worthiness of said accomplishment. I think that's reasonable. They don't make the playoffs for 4 years, and Kucherov missed the playoffs 1 time in his time in Tampa Bay. Draisaitl misses it 4 straight seasons. Then the Oilers have started to put something together around them. And the book is obviously not closed on either of these guys or either of these organizations for that matter. I think it's not out of the realm of possibility. You see the Oilers win a Stanley Cup at some point in the next 2 or 3 seasons. And then we can have a bigger conversation about these two as far as who you want all time, who's better all time. Because it's a worthy argument. I think when you compare the resumes, Kucherov's is a smidge better. He's got the cups. He's got the heart as the unchallenged best player on his team, whereas Draisaitl did win the heart, but it came in the season McDavid missed some time. So I think there's definitely a bit of conjecture there. I know there is still a vocal minority that doesn't think Draisaitl is as good as he actually is because of the fact he's on such a good team, because he's so lethal on the power play, all of that, sure, whatever. Draisaitl and Kucherov are 2 of the best players of this era. Arguably, you would probably say 2 of the top 10 players of this era. I mean, even now, Kucherov, after all the miles, after all the injuries, is still an elite player. Leon's having arguably the best season of his entire career so far through the first 30 games or so, 2024, 2025. And the only real argument about this trade is why it fell apart. Jeff Marek says it's because the Oilers were asking for more stuff. Specifically, they were asking for Anthony Cirelli in addition to Kucherov in return for Draisaitl. And Tampa Bay, to its credit, said no. And I think a more desperate general manager would have been more inclined to consider that seriously. I don't think Julien Brisebois would have done that, even if it was a more dire situation. But I do think it's a testament to the simple fact that there are a lot of things that general managers are engaged with that we don't know about, and we frankly won't ever know about unless someone out of the kindness of their heart wants to tell us, or more likely they want to get some engagement. And it's unfortunate that I had to do 10 whole minutes about why maybe you take this report with a grain of salt, but that's the reality of the media landscape in 2024. And it's why I don't venture into the news breaking stuff, because I don't have the sources. Occasionally, yeah, you make friends, you get a tip, but I myself do not have a way of verifying said tip. So I don't go out and report something that I don't know is true or not. There is an ethical responsibility to not do that if you know better. And a lot of people do know better, but being sports media being what it is in the present, where it is so social media algorithm driven, you have to do stuff like this on occasion. And I would like to know if it's Cirelli is why it fell apart, or if there was more than that at play. But I, for one, can't complain. This gave us a whole episode to talk about a fun hypothetical and to highlight 2 of the really special players in our game, 2 people who are remarkable, all-time great talents. And it's an interesting thought exercise, and you really do wonder where the Lightning and the Oilers would have respectively gone. Naturally, you would ask, do you think the Lightning would have won at least one of the 2 cups with Draisaitl instead of Kucherov? It's a fair question. I don't know. Do you think the Oilers would be better positioned now, being that they had Kucherov, who was a few years older? Do you think the Oilers would have peaked a little bit sooner? Do you think maybe they go on a deep run in 2019, 2020, as opposed to getting back to the playoffs in 2020, 2021? That's why this is a fun exercise and why it's worth a whole episode. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. I will talk to you guys tonight after the game against the Bruins with hopefully a win in tow after dropping the hard one on Monday. Talk to you guys then.